My son stood in the center of the 2,000-square-foot penthouse and screamed that I was nothing but extra luggage. He demanded I pay rent or leave, completely unaware that the deed to this apartment, the keys to his luxury car, and the company paying his salary were all in my name. I did not cry. I simply untied my grease-stained apron, walked out into the snow, and prepared to remind him exactly who owned his world. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and at 58 years old, I have mastered the art of becoming invisible in a room full of people. I tightened the knot of my grease-stained apron and squeezed my way through the throng of nearly 25 guests crowding the living room of the 2,100-square-foot penthouse in downtown Denver. The air smelled of expensive pine from the tree that scraped the ceiling and the heavy, oaky scent of vintage Cabernet. Crystal glasses clinked against each other like warning bells. Everyone was laughing, their mouths moving in shapes that spoke of stock portfolios, Aspen ski trips, and year-end bonuses, while I moved silently between them, collecting discarded napkins and empty hors d'oeuvre platters. My son, Lucas, stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows with the city lights glittering behind him like diamonds he claimed to have mined himself. At 33, he looked every inch the successful construction engineer at Novaline Structures. His white dress shirt was crisp, his sleeves rolled up just enough to show off the heavy Swiss watch on his wrist. He was gesturing wildly, his face flushed with wine and pride. "It's all about grit," Lucas announced, his voice booming over the soft jazz playing in the background. "You hustle, you grind, and you buy the view. Nobody handed this to me. I built this life brick by brick." I paused near the kitchen island, scrubbing a stubborn red wine stain off the marble counter. A few feet away, Madison, his wife, leaned against the shoulder of a woman I recognized as a local fashion blogger. Madison swirled her drink, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light. "Honestly, I don't know how he does it," Madison said, pitching her voice loud enough for the room to hear. "The HOA fees alone in this building are criminal, not to mention the mortgage. Lucas carries the weight of this entire household on his back. It is exhausting for him. You know, having to support everyone." She cast a quick, pitying glance in my direction. It was a calculated strike. She wanted everyone to know that I was the dead weight, the charity case living in the corner room. "You're a saint, Lucas," one of his cousins muttered, shaking his head. "Most guys our age wouldn't take in their mom. It's a huge burden." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning mix of shame and anger. I kept my head down, pouring another glass of Pinot Noir for a guest who didn't even look at me to say thank you. They looked right through me, seeing only a grey-haired woman in sensible shoes living off her son's generosity. The conversation shifted to the rising cost of downtown real estate. Lucas suddenly stood up straighter, clinking a spoon against his glass. The room quieted down. He looked swaying slightly, his eyes glassy but hard. "Speaking of costs," Lucas said, his smile tight and devoid of warmth, "I have been thinking a lot about equity, about fairness. In this economy, everyone has to pull their weight. Financial responsibility isn't just for strangers. It applies to family too." He turned slowly, his gaze locked onto me where I stood by the sink. The room seemed to freeze. "Mum," he barked, "we need to have a real talk. If you want to keep living here, you start paying half the rent effective next month. Or you leave. I can't. I can't keep carrying you forever." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I looked around the room. Not a single person met my eyes. Some looked at their shoes. Others nodded slightly, as if agreeing that it was high time the old leech was scraped off. 30 years of working double shifts, of hiding debt, of building a safety net so strong he never felt the ground shake. All of it was erased in 10 seconds of public humiliation. I carefully placed the wine bottle on the counter. My hands were steady. I reached behind me and untied the strings of my apron. I folded it neatly into a square and set it down beside the dirty dishes. "Thank you for making that clear," I said, my voice soft but cutting through the silence of the room. "This is certainly going to be a Christmas to remember. Lucas." I walked past him without looking back. I went into my small bedroom and closed the door. I did not pack. I did not cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the party awkwardly resume outside. In the darkness of my room, the warmth of motherly love began to cool, hardening into a block of ice that would become the foundation of my response. Sitting on the edge of the guest bed in the room my son allowed me to occupy, I looked down at my hands. They were wrinkled now, spotted with age, but beneath the skin, the muscles were still hard from decades of labor. My mind drifted back to a time before penthouses and Pinot Noir, back to the dusty winds of a small, forgotten town in Oklahoma. I was 19 then, smelling permanently of fryer grease and cheap diner coffee. I lived in a rusted mobile home where the walls were so thin you could hear the neighbors sneeze. And every time a storm rolled in, I lay awake praying the roof would hold. I promised myself back then that one day I would live in a house made of brick and stone, a fortress that the wind could never shake. Then I met Daniel. He was a construction worker with calloused hands and eyes the color of the Colorado sky. We married with plastic rings and moved into a shoebox apartment on the outskirts of Denver. We had nothing but ambition and a shared rage against injustice. We watched good families get evicted from our building just because they were 3 days late on rent. I remembered gripping Daniel's arm as we watched a young mother crying on the sidewalk, her belongings in trash bags. "We are going to be better than that." Daniel had told me, his voice trembling with determination. "When we are landlords, we won't treat people like trash." That promise became our religion. Daniel worked double shifts, coming home with drywall dust in his hair and his back screaming in pain. I took night classes, learning accounting and property law until my eyes burned. We ate beans and rice for 3 years straight. We wore clothes until they fell apart. We saved every single dime until we had enough for a down payment on a dilapidated house in Aurora that nobody else wanted. It was a ruin, but it was ours. Daniel climbed up to replace the rotting roof shingles while I scraped layers of peeling wallpaper and painted the walls until my shoulders went numb. We created a spreadsheet on a second-hand computer and called our little venture Summit Hearth Properties. We rented it out to a young couple for 20% below market rate. We still made a profit, but more importantly, we gave them a home. Lucas was just a boy then. I remember him sleeping on a folding mattress in the living room while Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table, arguing in hushed tones about loan interest rates and mortgage payments. "It's too risky." "Danny," I would whisper, clutching the calculator. "If the bank calls the loan." "They won't," he would say, squeezing my hand. "We are building something for him, so he never has to sleep on a floor unless he wants to." Lucas saw the struggle. He saw the sweat. But somewhere along the way, he forgot the lesson. Over 15 years, one house became 5, then 10, then 30. We bought run-down townhouses and old brick buildings. We kept the rents fair and the maintenance high. Everything was in our names, but I was the one who managed the legal structures, the trusts, and the LLCs. I was the silent engine. Then came the darkest day. I was 48 when the police knocked on my door. An accident at a site inspection. Daniel was gone before the ambulance even arrived. Lucas was in college, complaining about his fraternity dues, while I was burying the only man who ever truly knew me. Grief could have destroyed me. Instead, it hardened me into steel. I took our grief and poured it into the business. Summit Hearth Properties expanded aggressively. I bought apartment complexes and commercial spaces, growing our portfolio to over 60 high-value assets. But I hated the spotlight. I hated the vultures who preyed on wealthy widows. So I hired Victor Hale, a sharp man with a good smile, to be the CEO. I told the world he ran the show. You be the face. Victor. I had told him as we signed his contract. Take the interviews. Take the credit. I just want to work in peace. I retreated into the shadows, listed only in the deepest internal documents as the controlling shareholder. To the world, and to my ungrateful son. I was just Eleanor, the widow who lived simply and perhaps had a small pension. I let Lucas believe his success was entirely his own, never telling him that the company hiring him, the scholarships he won, and the cheap apartment he rented were all quietly subsidized by the empire his father and I built with our blood. I looked up at the closed door of the bedroom, hearing Lucas's drunken laughter from the living room. He had no idea. He thought he was kicking a helpless old woman out into the cold. He did not know he was declaring war on the chairman of the board. The silence in the guest room was heavy, but the weight in my chest was heavier. It was the crushing weight of memory, specifically the memory of my own foolishness. I sat there in the dark, tracing the pattern on the quilt, and forced myself to admit how I had engineered my own humiliation. It started 3 years ago, right when Lucas landed his first job as a junior engineer. He had come to me, his face pale with stress, complaining that his starting salary could barely cover a studio apartment in the suburbs, let alone the life he felt he deserved. Mum, I can't live like a monk, he had said, pacing around my modest kitchen, running his hands through his hair. I'm an engineer. I need to look the part. If I live in a dump, clients won't respect me. My heart had softened, that dangerous, melting feeling that every mother knows. I wanted him to be proud. I wanted him to walk into rooms with his head high, not weighed down by the poverty I had known at his age. So, I offered him the vacancy at the River North Art District building, one of the crown jewels of the Summit Hearth portfolio. I know the management company. I had lied, my voice steady. They have a unit. I can get it for you at half the market rate. I'll cover the difference until you get on your feet. I remembered the day he signed the lease. The document clearly stated the landlord as Summit Hearth Properties, LLC, and the tenant as Lucas Brooks. He had scribbled his signature at the bottom without even glancing at the ownership clause. He did not ask who owned the LLC. He did not ask why the terms were so generous. He just signed, assuming the world was bending to his will because he was special. That moment had stung. A small prick in my heart that I chose to ignore. Then came Madison. She swept into his life like a hurricane of perfume and hashtags. The first time Lucas brought her to the penthouse, she didn't thank me. She ran to the balcony, posing against the skyline. I watched from the kitchen island as she snapped a photo and typed a caption that I later saw on her feed. My fiancé made it. Self-made man. Dream home. I said nothing. I swallowed the truth like a bitter pill because I thought his happiness was worth my silence. The lies compounded. I wanted him to look successful on the job sites, so I signed over the authorization for a luxury SUV from the company fleet. It's just a loaner. Lucas, I had told him, handing him the heavy fob. Just until you save enough to buy your own. Thanks. Mom, he had said, snatching the keys. This will really show the partners I mean business. He never asked about the insurance. He never asked about the monthly payments. He just drove it away. And then came the credit card. I opened a supplementary card on my personal account, handing it to him with a strict warning. This is for emergencies only. Lucas, I had said, pressing the plastic into his hand. If your car breaks down, or if you have a medical issue, I know. Mum? Stop worrying. He had replied, but the definition of emergency shifted rapidly. The first bill came in with a charge for a $500 dinner at a steakhouse, then a weekend trip to Vail, then a designer handbag that I knew was hanging on Madison's shoulder. Every month. I sat at my small desk in my real home, a humble one-story house in Lakewood, and wrote the checks to cover his emergencies. I stared at the line items, Brooks, Lucas, supplementary charge, each time. I told myself that he was building a network, that he would pay me back in gratitude once he was established. I was wrong. As Lucas climbed the ladder at Nova Line Structures, he began to believe the myth we had constructed together. He truly believed he was a self-made genius. He forgot the subsidized rent. He forgot the free car. He forgot the magic credit card. And as his ego grew, I shrank. I made myself smaller and smaller to leave room for his pride, until I became exactly what he saw tonight, a poor, dependent old woman mooching off his success. I realized then, sitting alone while the party raged outside, that I had done this. By hiding the source of his comfort, I had handed him the weapon he just used to stab me. I had declawed myself in the name of love. But as I listened to the muffled bass of the music through the wall, I knew one thing for certain: claws can grow back. I locked the heavy oak door of the guest bedroom and turned the deadbolt, effectively sealing myself off from the party that was slowly dying down in the living room. My hands were trembling, not from sorrow, but from a cold, sharp clarity that had suddenly possessed me. I knelt by my suitcase and pulled out the small, fireproof document bag I always travelled with. It was a habit from the early days when Daniel and I feared losing everything to a house fire. I unzipped it and spread the papers out on the duvet. The documents were undeniable. The deed to the penthouse, the registration for the luxury SUV Lucas drove, the commercial lease agreement, the credit card statements. Every single page bore the same header, Summit Hearth Properties, LLC, and in the fine print below, controlling shareholder Eleanor Brooks. I pulled out my phone and dialed Victor Hale. It was Christmas night, but I knew he would answer. He picked up on the second ring, his face appearing on my screen against a background of festive lights. "Eleanor," he asked, sounding concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Get Marissa on the line," I said, my voice devoid of any tremor. Now. 2 minutes later. A split screen showed Marissa Doyle, our 50-year-old in-house counsel. She was wearing a silk robe, her dark skin glowing in the light of her laptop screen, her expression sharp and alert. "Merry Christmas." "Eleanor," Marissa said cautiously, "this feels urgent." It is, I replied. I looked down at the lease agreement in my hand. The lease for the penthouse at the River North Art District, the one occupied by Lucas Brooks. When is the renewal date? January 1st. Victor answered immediately. We were just going to auto-renew it as usual. Do not renew it. I commanded. Draft a notice of non-renewal. Prepare a termination of tenancy letter. I want it served with the minimum notice period required by Colorado state law. Not a day more. Victor blinked, stunned. Eleanor, that is next week. I know, I said. Next item. The company vehicle. The black SUV authorized for Lucas Brooks. I want the authorization revoked within 48 hours. Have the asset recovery team on standby with a tow truck. If he does not surrender the keys voluntarily, take it. Marissa leaned closer to her camera. Eleanor. Wait. Repossession. That is aggressive. He wanted financial responsibility, I said, picking up the credit card statement. I am giving it to him. Speaking of which, I am calling the bank tonight to cancel the supplementary credit card issued to him. I want a full statement for the last 12 months sent to my personal email. I want to see every cent of debt I have been forgiving. The line was silent for a long moment. Marissa took off her reading glasses. Eleanor, she said softly. Are you sure about this? 3 hits at once. It is going to put the boy in a free fall. He won't be able to breathe. I felt a phantom pain in my chest, the echo of Lucas's voice yelling at me in front of 24 strangers. He pushed me out of my own house first. I whispered, my throat tight. I am just letting him fall into the hole he dug for himself. I ended the call. I did not sleep. I spent the rest of the night packing my few belongings. I called a private car service from the company account and told them to pick me up at dawn to take me to Lakewood to the small, 1-story house that Lucas did not even know existed. The house where the real work happened. At 6 a.m, the penthouse was silent. The air smelled of stale wine and regret. I dragged my suitcase down the hallway. I made sure the hard plastic wheels clattered loudly against the polished marble floor. The noise woke them. Lucas stumbled out of the master bedroom, wearing only his boxers, his eyes puffy from sleep. Madison appeared behind him, wrapped in a silk sheet. Mom? Lucas squinted, shielding his eyes from the morning sun streaming through the windows. What? What are you doing? It's 6 a.m. I am leaving, I said, buttoning my coat. As per your eviction notice. Lucas ran a hand through his messy hair, looking annoyed, but also slightly guilty. Mom, come on. Don't be dramatic. I didn't mean you had to leave right now. We were just saying you need to contribute. Yeah. Eleanor. Madison chimed in, her voice raspy. Don't make a scene. It's Christmas morning. For God's sake. I looked at them both. They looked so small, so fragile in their borrowed luxury. Rest assured, I said, gripping the handle of my suitcase. I won't be a burden to you anymore. Not for one more second. I opened the heavy front door and walked out. The elevator ride down was silent. When I stepped out into the biting Denver cold, a black sedan with the Summit Hearth logo on the windshield was waiting. The driver opened the door for me. I slid into the leather seat, and as we pulled away from the curb, I did not look up at the window. The coldness inside me had settled. The war to restore the honor of the Brooks name had officially begun. The morning after Christmas brought a silence to the penthouse that Lucas likely mistook for peace, at least until he checked his phone. I was miles away in my small house in Lakewood. But thanks to the detailed updates from my team, I could visualize every second of his unraveling as if I were standing right there in the room. Lucas woke up to a cold kitchen and an empty coffee pot. There was no note from me, only a notification blinking on his screen. It was an email from Summit Hearth Property Management. The subject line was dull, but the content was a guillotine falling on his neck. It stated clearly that his lease would not be renewed and that he had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. I imagine him dialing the number at the bottom of the email, his fingers likely trembling with a mix of hangover and indignation. This has to be a mistake, Lucas shouted into the phone, pacing the living room floor. I am a preferred tenant. I work for Novaline. You can't just kick me out in 30 days. The property manager, following my strict instructions, kept her voice devoid of emotion. It is the owner's decision. Mr. Brooks, we are simply enforcing the contract terms. You have until January 25th to hand over the keys. Who is the owner? Lucas demanded, his voice cracking. Put them on the phone. I want to talk to whoever thinks they can do this to me. Ownership information is company confidential, the manager replied. Unless you have a legal subpoena, I cannot help you. Have a good day. Before Lucas could even process the fact that he was effectively homeless, his phone rang again. This time, it was Madison. She was calling from the high-end mall downtown, and she was hysterical. Lucas Madison screamed, her voice shrill enough to distort the speaker. My card. It was declined. I am standing here with a line of people behind me, holding a bag of cosmetics, and the cashier cut the card right in front of my face. Lucas rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the chaos. What? That's impossible. It's a platinum card. There is no limit. The bank said it was reported lost or stolen by the primary account holder, Madison yelled, her breathing ragged. They said Eleanor Brooks authorized the block. You told me the company gave us this card. You said it was a corporate perk. Why is your mother blocking our money? Lucas stood frozen in the middle of the living room. The illusion of his self-made success was fracturing in real time. But the final blow came in the afternoon. A heavy knock echoed through the penthouse. When Lucas opened the door, he found two large men wearing jackets emblazoned with the Summit Hearth Asset Unit logo. They were not smiling. Mr. Brooks, one of them asked, holding out a clipboard. We are here for the black SUV. Authorization for use has been revoked by the fleet manager effective immediately. That is my car, Lucas stammered, blocking the doorway. You can't just take it. The man held up a copy of the vehicle registration. According to this, the vehicle belongs to Summit Hearth Properties. We have a spare key. Mr. Brooks. We are just being polite by asking for yours. Don't make us call the police for Grand Theft Auto. Lucas looked past the men, down the hallway. A few neighbors had poked their heads out, whispering and watching the humiliation unfold. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. He walked to the entry table, grabbed the heavy key fob, and shoved it into the man's hand. He watched from the balcony as his status symbol was hooked up to a tow truck and dragged away, leaving an empty spot in the driveway and an empty pit in his stomach. Back inside, Madison was no longer screaming. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by documents she had pulled from the filing cabinet. She held up the lease agreement, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying realization. Lucas, she said, her voice trembling. Look at this. The lease, the car registration, the credit card statement, everything. It all says Summit Hearth. So what? Lucas snapped, pacing like a caged animal. Mom probably just, I don't know, managed the paperwork for the company. No, you idiot, Madison hissed. Look at the signature line on the lease. It doesn't say manager, it says controlling shareholder. She threw the paper at him. Who is your mother, really? Lucas scrambled for his laptop. He typed Summit Hearth Properties ownership into the search bar. He scrolled past the generic corporate landing pages, past the tenant portals, until he found a digital archive of a local business journal from 15 years ago. It was an article about the founding of the company. There, buried in the text, was a grainy black and white photograph. It showed a younger Victor Hale shaking hands with the mayor, but standing slightly behind him, looking sharp and formidable in a simple blazer, was my face. The caption read, E. Brooks, founding partner and majority owner of Summit Hearth, prefers to stay out of the limelight. Lucas stared at the screen. The silence in the room was deafening. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was not just fighting a landlord or a bank. He was at war with the woman who had made him. And for the first time, he realized just how outgunned he truly was. Victor later told me that seeing Lucas walk into the Summit Hearth headquarters was like watching a king return to a castle he had forgotten he did not own. He arrived in a cheap, compact rental car that rattled when it idled, a stark contrast to the luxury SUV he had lost just 24 hours prior. He stormed past the reception desk, his face pale and unshaven, demanding to speak to whoever is ruining my life. The receptionist, following protocol, called Victor. My CEO met him in the lobby with a professional smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes, and guided him into a small, glass-walled conference room. Lucas did not sit. He paced the length of the room, ranting about tenant rights and the injustice of the eviction. Victor let him finish, then silently slid a thick file across the mahogany table. Read the first page. Lucas, Victor said calmly. Lucas flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the corporate structure chart, moving past the shell companies and the management layers until they landed on the name at the very top. Eleanor Brooks, majority owner and chairwoman. This is a mistake, Lucas stammered, his voice barely a whisper. My mother. She just manages the books. She is a housewife. She is the architect of everything you see. Victor corrected him, his tone hardening. I only run the day-to-day operations. Every asset you have been using, the penthouse, the car, the credit line, was authorized directly by her, and every asset was revoked by her. She signed the orders last night. Lucas collapsed into the chair, the air rushing out of him as if he had been punched. Why would she lie to me for so long? She did not lie, Victor said, leaning forward. She protected you. She wanted you to build your own character without the crutch of her money. But you used her silence to build a pedestal for yourself instead. She doesn't owe you a display of her wealth, Lucas. But you owed her the basic respect due to a mother. You failed to pay that debt on Christmas Eve. Desperate for an ally, Lucas left the office and drove to the rehabilitation center to see my mother, Agatha. He expected sympathy. He expected his grandmother to be outraged that her daughter was treating her grandson so harshly. But Agatha, frail as a bird, yet sharp as a tack at 80 years old, listened to his complaints with eyes that narrowed into slits. You are a fool, boy, Agatha snapped, her voice raspy but strong. Grandma, she kicked me out, Lucas pleaded, his voice breaking. She is ruining me. Agatha laughed, a dry, coughing sound. Ruining you. She made you. Do you know how she paid for your first semester of college when the business was lean? She sold her wedding ring, the one your father gave her. She replaced it with a cubic zirconia so you wouldn't know she was struggling. She stayed up for 3 nights in a row doing tax returns for other people just to buy you that laptop you claimed you needed for engineering school. Lucas stared at her, tears pooling in his eyes. I didn't know. Because she didn't want you to feel the weight of it, Agatha yelled, her monitor beeping faster. She didn't want you to be a spoiled brat. She wanted a man. And look what we got instead. A boy who throws his mother out of her own house because he thinks he is too good for her. Lucas left the hospital broken. For the first time, the bubble of his self-made myth had popped. He drove back to the penthouse, where the boxes were already piling up. Madison was there, frantically looking through apartment listings on her tablet. When Lucas told her the truth that I owned it all, that I was the reason they had lived like royalty, her anger shifted instantly into cold calculation. Then apologize, Madison demanded, not looking up from her screen. Go to her house, cry, beg, whatever it takes. Lucas, we cannot live in a studio apartment. Fix this. It's not about the money, Madison, Lucas said quietly, looking at his hands. I hurt her. I don't care about feelings, Madison screamed, throwing a throw pillow across the room. I care about my life. Get my credit card back. In that moment, amidst the shouting and the boxes, Lucas finally understood. My goal was not just to punish him. I was stripping away the insulation. I was forcing him to feel the cold wind of the real world, real rent, real bills, and the real consequences of his arrogance. I was not just taking my things back. I was forcing him to finally meet the man he actually was, stripped of his mother's empire. The reality of gravity is that the higher you are, the harder you hit the ground. Lucas landed in Commerce City, in a studio apartment that smelled of stale tobacco and boiled cabbage. The building was a grey, concrete block where the elevator had been out of order for 6 months, forcing him to haul his suitcases up 4 flights of stairs. The rent for this shoebox was $1,500 a month, a sum that used to be a rounding error on his credit card statement, but now consumed nearly half of his take-home pay. The second blow came before he had even unpacked his socks. Madison stood by the door, her designer luggage already waiting in the hallway. She looked at the cracked plaster on the ceiling and then at Lucas with a look of pure disdain. I am going back to Florida, she announced, checking her reflection in her phone screen. My parents said I can stay in the guest house. I can't live like this. Lucas, call me when you fix this. When you are, you again. She left him in the silence of the empty room. There was no tearful goodbye, just the sound of her heels clicking away down the linoleum corridor. Lucas sat on the floor, surrounded by his boxes, and for the first time in his life, he opened a spreadsheet to calculate his actual budget. It was a massacre. After rent, utilities, car payments for the cheap sedan he had been forced to lease, and student loans that I had stopped paying for him, he was left with maybe $300 a month for food and everything else. He stared at the number on the screen. $300. That used to be what Madison spent on a single manicure. At Novaline Structures, the humiliation continued. He no longer rolled into the parking lot in a luxury SUV. He parked his dented sedan in the back row, hoping no one would notice. But they did. The whispers followed him to the coffee machine. The pressure to perform was suffocating, and for the first time, he considered asking for overtime not to impress a boss, but because he actually needed the extra $50. His salvation came from an unlikely source. The tenant living in the unit above him was a 60-year-old man named Miguel, a plumber with rough hands and a persistent cough. One evening, when Lucas was struggling to fix a leaking pipe under his sink because he could not afford to call a professional, Miguel knocked on the open door. "You're holding the wrench wrong, kid," Miguel said, stepping inside without an invitation. Over the next few weeks, Miguel taught Lucas how to shop for groceries at the discount market and how to patch drywall. But more importantly, he shared stories over cheap beer. Miguel spoke about landlords who raised rent by 20% overnight, about families evicted for complaining about mold, and about the constant fear of losing the roof over your head. "They squeeze you," Miguel told him one night, crushing a beer can in his hand. "They squeeze you until you pop, and then they just sweep you out for the next guy." Lucas listened, and for the first time, he understood. He realized why I had fought so hard to keep our rents stable. He realized that the business I ran was not just about profit margins, it was a shield for people like Miguel. The turning point came late one Tuesday night. Lucas had brought work home, a design for a client who wanted a high-end complex. The client had rejected his initial draft, claiming the materials were too expensive. Frustrated, Lucas looked around his tiny, cramped studio. He looked at the efficient way Miguel had organized his small kitchen. A spark lit up in his tired brain. He pushed the luxury blueprints aside and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He began to sketch. Not a mansion, but a module. A housing unit designed to be cheap to build, energy efficient, and durable. He used the constraints of his own poverty to solve the problem. "If I use recycled steel here," he muttered to himself, his pencil flying across the paper. "And if we standardize the plumbing wall, we cut costs by 30%. He worked until 3 a.m. There was no expensive wine on his desk, just a glass of tap water. He was not drawing to impress a girl or buy a watch. He was drawing because, for the first time, he saw the people who would live inside the lines. From my house in Lakewood, I watched the reports come in. My private investigator sent photos of the dented car and the lights burning in his window until dawn. I saw the credit card statements showing purchases at dollar stores instead of steakhouses. My phone rang 3 times that week with his number on the caller ID. I let it ring. I stared at the screen, my heart aching to answer, to tell him I was proud of him for surviving. But I knew the lesson was not over. Silence was the only way to ensure the seed of integrity had actually taken root. 3 months into his exile, Lucas had ceased to be a tourist in the land of poverty and had begun to inhabit it. The reports I received showed that he was no longer drinking expensive scotch to numb the shame. Instead, he was spending his nights hunched over a drafting table in that cramped studio, refining the blueprints for his modular housing project. It was Miguel, his neighbor, who finally bridged the gap between Lucas's redemption and my endgame. Miguel had a drinking buddy who worked as a scout for an investment fund, specifically looking for affordable housing solutions. When Lucas received the email inviting him to pitch his urban compact living project, he likely saw it as a lifeline thrown by fate. He did not notice the address until the morning of the presentation. It was on the same avenue as the Summit Hearth headquarters. I imagine his stomach turned over as he walked down that familiar street. Not in a tailored Italian suit, but in a jacket borrowed from Miguel that was a size too big in the shoulders. He carried his scratched laptop like a shield. When he stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor, he didn't see the usual reception desk. He saw a frosted glass wall etched with the words Summit Hearth Impact Fund. He stood frozen in the hallway. I could see him through the glass. He looked like an animal realizing it had walked into a trap. But he took a breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The conference room was cold and smelled of ozone and lemon polish. Victor sat to my right. Marissa sat to my left, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. 2 other board members were reviewing his printed handouts. And at the head of the table, wearing a charcoal grey suit and my reading glasses, sat me. Lucas stopped dead in his tracks. His hand gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles turning white. He looked from Victor to me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He looked ready to turn around and run back to the elevator. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks," I said, my voice stripping away any trace of maternal warmth. "Today, I am not your mother. I am the chairwoman of this investment committee. If you intend to run away because the room is uncomfortable, please do so immediately. It will save us all valuable time." Lucas swallowed hard. He looked at the door, then back at me. A flicker of something new appeared in his eyes. It was not arrogance. It was desperation mixed with resolve. "I'm not running," Lucas said, his voice shaking slightly before he steadied it. "I'm here to pitch, then pitch," I commanded. He connected his laptop. For the next 20 minutes, the boy who used to brag about imported marble and skyline views spoke about thermal insulation and cost per square foot efficiency. He did not use buzzwords. He used the reality of his last 90 days. "This 3-story design minimizes the footprint," Lucas explained, pointing to the screen. "It uses recycled industrial steel. I know the materials are cheap, but the structure is sound. I currently live in a unit where the wind comes through the walls. I know that energy costs are the difference between eating and starving for this demographic. My design accounts for that." The room was silent. Victor nodded slowly. One of the other investors leaned forward. "The profit margins are razor thin, Mr. Brooks," the investor noted. "Why would we take this risk? Construction delays alone could wipe out the equity." "Because the demand is infinite," Lucas replied without hesitation. "And because people deserve dignity, even if they can't pay a premium for it." I watched him. He was sweating, but he was standing his ground. I waited for a lull in the questioning before I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. "Let's talk about risk management," I said, locking eyes with him. "Your personal financial history suggests a certain looseness with credit. If this project goes over budget, and you are the project lead, what happens? Do you expect the fund to bail you out? Do you expect a supplementary credit line?" Lucas flinched. The reference to the credit card I had cut off hung in the air like smoke. He looked down at his scratched laptop, then lifted his head to meet my gaze. "No," Lucas said softly. "If it fails, it is on me. I have learned that there is no such thing as free money. I will sign a personal liability clause if I have to." Marissa raised an eyebrow. I kept my face impassive. "The numbers are not impressive, Mr. Brooks," I said, closing the folder in front of me. "But the vision has merit. We are not making a decision today." Lucas looked like he might collapse from the adrenaline crash. "We will give you our answer in 72 hours. I stated, checking my watch. I suggest you use that time to prepare for the next phase, or to look for other investors. And Lucas. He paused halfway out of his chair. Learn to wait, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear clearly. Patience is the only thing you can afford right now. Don't spend it before you have it. He nodded once, turned, and walked out of the room. As the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding, my hand trembling beneath the table. While Lucas paced the floor of his cramped studio, staring at the water stains on the ceiling and terrified not of poverty, but of failing the first people who had ever trusted him with a real problem. I sat in the boardroom at Summit Hearth and held his fate in my hands. The air in the room was stale, recycled through the vents, heavy with the scent of coffee and tension. Victor sat to my right, tapping a pen against the mahogany table. Marissa was on my left, and across from us sat Robert, a senior board member who knew where the bodies were buried. The financials are thin. Eleanor, Robert said, sliding the projection papers back toward me. The social impact score is high. Yes, it looks good for the brand. But if we look at the project lead, this is Lucas, the same Lucas who treated the company credit card like a toy. If he crashes this, are you prepared to write off the loss? More importantly, are you prepared to watch him fail again? His question hung in the air like smoke. I felt a sharp, squeezing sensation in the center of my chest, a dull ache that I had been ignoring for months. I realized then that my revenge plan had a cost I had not calculated on my spreadsheets. I had spent every waking hour since Christmas orchestrating this lesson, maneuvering the pieces, suppressing my maternal instinct to run in and save him. The stress had calcified in my arteries. I looked down at the timeline I had drawn in my notebook. Christmas Eve. The humiliation. January. The eviction. February. The car repossession. March. The proposal. It was a perfect, cold equation of cause and effect. I am not asking you to trust him, I said, my voice steady despite the thumping in my ears. I am asking you to trust the contract. We approve the seed funding. But Lucas Brooks is named project director with full operational liability. If he goes over budget by even 1%, we pull the plug. No bailouts. No safety nets. He sinks or swims on his own. Victor looked at me, his eyes wide. That is incredibly strict. Eleanor. If the market fluctuates, he is dead in the water. He needs to know the water is deep. I replied. I reached for the black fountain pen to sign the authorization decree. He needs to know that this time, nobody is coming to pull him out. I uncapped the pen. The ink tip hovered over the signature line. Eleanor Brooks, chairwoman. Then the room tilted. A crushing weight, like an iron anvil, slammed into my chest. The pain was absolute and blinding. I tried to gasp, but my lungs refused to fill. The pen clattered onto the glass surface of the table, rolling away. I saw Victor's face distort, his mouth moving in a shout I could not hear. My vision narrowed to a pinhole of light. I slumped forward, my forehead hitting the cool wood of the table with a sickening thud. Call 911. Victor's voice broke through the roaring in my ears. Marissa, get the kit, Eleanor. Stay with me. Across the city. Lucas's phone rang. He later told me he almost didn't answer it, afraid it was a rejection. When he heard the nurse's voice telling him I had collapsed from a suspected myocardial infarction, he didn't ask about the project. He didn't ask about the money. He dropped his phone, ran out of his apartment without locking the door. and screamed at a taxi driver to drive faster than the speed limit allowed. I woke up in the ICU. The lights were too bright. The beep of the monitor was a rhythmic hammer against my skull. An oxygen mask was strapped to my face, making every breath taste like plastic. Victor was standing by the bed, his face pale and lined with worry. He was holding the unsigned document. I tried to lift my hand, but it felt like lead. I motioned for him to come closer. He leaned down, his ear near my lips. The project. I wheezed, my voice barely a scrap of sound. Lucas. Shh. Eleanor. Rest. Victor whispered. We put it on hold. It doesn't matter right now. I grabbed his wrist with a strength I didn't know I had. I pulled him down until our eyes met. No, I managed to say, fighting the darkness at the edge of my vision. Sign it. Don't cancel it. The project must go through, even if I am not here to watch him. Victor stared at me, tears welling in his eyes. He nodded slowly, understanding finally that this was not just a business deal. It was my legacy. It was the only way I could leave my son something real. I will sign it, Victor promised. He will get his chance. I closed my eyes, the pain receding into a dull hum, and waited for my son to arrive. It took 6 weeks for my heart to stabilize enough for the doctors to sign my discharge papers. They warned me to avoid stress, to keep my blood pressure low, and to retire in the traditional sense of the word. They did not understand that my heart would never beat steadily until I finished what I had started. The modular housing project was approved with full transparency. The local papers ran headlines about Summit Hearth investing in the future of affordable living, with Lucas Brooks named as the project director. Lucas visited me every day. He brought blueprints instead of flowers. He looked tired, older, and thinner. But for the first time, he looked like a man who stood on his own 2 feet. I treated him with a detached, professional courtesy that I knew confused him. You don't have to be so cold. Mom, he said one afternoon, rolling up a schematic. I am trying. In this office, I am not your mother. I replied, looking over my reading glasses. I am your investor. And outside of this office, if you want to rebuild the sun, you have a different debt to pay. It is not about money. As Christmas approached, Victor suggested we celebrate the project launch with a quiet dinner at a modest diner. He wanted to protect me. No, I said, closing the file on my desk. I want the dinner to be held at the River North penthouse. It is currently listed as a short-term event rental. Book it for Christmas night. Victor hesitated. Eleanor, that is cruel. Why drag him back to the scene of the crime? Because he chose that stage to humiliate me, I said softly. If he has truly changed, he must stand on that same stage to fix it. If he cannot do that, then we have achieved nothing. The night of the party, the penthouse looked exactly as it had a year ago. The crystals sparkled, the tree scraped the ceiling, and the city lights of Denver glittered below us. We invited the same 24 guests, the cousins who had nodded in agreement when Lucas evicted me, the friends who had sipped my wine while I cleaned up their mess. They stood around awkwardly, whispering about the affordable housing project, unsure of the new dynamic. Lucas stood by the window, looking pale. He was not wearing a Swiss watch. He was wearing a simple suit he had bought off the rack. I watched him from the kitchen island, the exact spot where I used to stand in my apron. I waited until the room was full, until the chatter was at its peak. Then I picked up a spoon and tapped it hard against my champagne flute. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I did not shrink away this time. I walked to the center of the room, standing directly in front of Lucas. 1 year ago, right here. I began, my voice clear and steady. You stood up and told me that everyone must pay their way. You screamed at me, in front of everyone, that if I wanted to live here, I had to pay you rent or get out. You told me you could not carry me anymore. Lucas looked down at his shoes, his face burning. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm. Today, I continued, it is my turn to ask you to pay what is owed, but I do not want your money. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. I am the sole owner of Summit Hearth Properties, I revealed, my voice rising just enough to reach the back of the room. I own this building. I own the deed to this penthouse. I owned the luxury car you drove for 3 years. I paid every single credit card bill you ran up while pretending to be a self-made man. For 30 years. I worked in the shadows, scrubbing floors and balancing books so you could sleep on a soft mattress. The room gasped. I saw Madison's friend drop her fork. I saw the cousin's jaws drop. Lucas looked up, tears streaming down his face, but he did not look away. I do not tell you this to shame you, I said, stepping closer to him. I tell you this because a man is only as good as his truth. I am not asking for a check. Lucas, I am asking for the truth. Right now, in front of the people you lied to, in front of the people who watched you throw me out. You have a choice. I pointed to the crowd. You can keep your pride and walk out that door, and I will cut you from my life and this project forever. I said, my voice trembling with the effort to hold back my own tears. Or you can pay me now, with honesty. Tell them who really built this life. Tell them what you did. Pay me with your courage, or I leave. And this time, Lucas, it will be forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I truly hope it resonated with you. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on Lucas's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people.